Okay, non-chord tones. Now it's easy to see if we already know that this is a D major chord and it's taking up this whole bar, which, by the way, remember that that's not always true. It's true in this case, in this piece that we're looking at right now, that the chord applies to the whole bar. And I think it was true in an earlier piece we looked at, but it's not always true. Sometimes chords only last a beat or sometimes even less. But in our case, the chord is taking up the whole bar because that's what it's been doing the whole piece. And we know that this is a canon and it's, repeating the same pattern over and over. So we know that this whole bar we're calling a D major chord or a 1 chord, right? So how do we explain these two notes that are not in that chord? Let's just use this bar right here as an example. There's a couple different ways. First of all, we're going to call those non-chord tones. So a non-chord tone just means that it is a tone that's happening, or a note that's happening inside of the chord that does not fit the chord, right? If we didn't know what chord was happening right now, let's just kind of erase everything from our brain and say, we don't know what chord this is. So how can we figure out this chord? So we have a D in the bass. We have a D above. Now we have an E. Does that belong in the chord? Does this F and this E and this D belong in the chord? Does this G belong in the chord? Probably not, because we wouldn't have any assortment of thirds by adding all 4 of these notes, right? If we dig through here and we try to find thirds, what we can find is this D and this F sharp. We can also find this E and this G. Okay, so that's a little bit better clue. Let's look a little bit deeper and say, well, of those 2 thirds, what's more likely? Right? Of D and F sharp is a third and E and G is a third. What's more likely to be in the chord that's taking up this space? Well, one big clue is going to be our bass note. Our bass note is a D. So the D and the F sharp are much more likely to be our chord tones, the tones that contribute to the chord and not the non-chord tones. Here's another big clue. And our big clue is where they happen on the beat. So in general, and this is a big general, but in general, we want chord tones to fall on strong beats of a measure. Strong beats are the downbeat right here, the first beat of a bar, and halfway through, the third beat of a bar if we're in 4/4 time. So these are strong beats. So we want our chord tones to happen on strong beats. That's not always true, but it certainly helps contribute to deciding that this is, in fact, a D major chord, right? Our bass note is D. We have a third of D here. We also have these 2 notes on strong beats, and the E and G notes are on weak beats. So it's a pretty safe assumption that this is going to be a D major chord. Even if the pattern wasn't repeating and we didn't know what it was, I would look at this and call this all a D major chord with 2 non-chord tones. Now a little bit more about non-chord tones. There's a whole bunch of different terms for non-chord tones. They're all like non-chord tone is like one big term, and then we have a whole bunch of smaller terms to call very specific tones, right? For example, how they behave, they get different names, and there's probably about 8 different kinds of non-chord tones. I'm not going to be concerned with those right now. Right now, I want us to identify non-chord tones. I don't want us to worry about the technical definition of, is this a passing tone or a neighbor tone or a changing tone? Those are the names of the kinds of non-chord tones. So to say that one more time, maybe a little clearer, non-chord tone is a general term for tones that are not in the chord. Inside of the term of non-chord tones, there are a whole bunch of little terms to specify how that non-chord tone is behaving. Like, is it walking up? Is it jumping up? Things like that. We're going to look at those in a future class, but right now I want us to just focus on identifying non-chord tones. So these, by the way, are, if we had to put one of those fancy terms on there, we would probably call these passing tones. But don't worry about that. They are non-chord tones to us for now. Let's look at this bar and see if everything holds true. So let's just forget everything we know. We don't know what chord this is or anything, okay? So we have an A in the bass. So right away, I'm thinking this is probably an A chord. The odds are in my favor that this is a chord based on A. So can I build a third anywhere using this? Here's an A. Well, that's good. If I had, what I really want is a C sharp and an E to finish out that chord. The next note is an E. That's good. The next note is another A. So no non-chord tones have happened here, right? This is going to be a non-chord tone, this G, because an A triad is made up of A, C sharp, E. So this isn't one of those. So this is a non-chord tone. It's happening on a weak beat. So we can kind of just call it a non-chord tone, and that's okay. But everything else falls into the chord of A. We don't have a third here, right? We don't have a C sharp, but that's okay for this instance. You know, there's no C sharp, but we don't have anything that points us away from A, right? We're just missing a tone. Let's do one more. Here we have a B. So again, my hunch is that we're on a B, and I need to be proven wrong here. So here's a B. My notes of a B triad are going to be B, D, and F sharp because we're in a minor key. We're in D major, but that means B is going to be a minor triad. So B, D, and F sharp makes a D or a B minor in the key of D major. That's the 6th scale degree, so it's a lowercase 6, but it's going to be a B minor chord. So let's try to find a B, a D, and an F. We have an F on a strong beat. That's good. We have a B on a weak beat. That's okay. We have an A on a strong beat. We have a non-chord tone on a strong beat. It's okay. It's not a deal breaker. And then we have a G, also a non-chord tone, right? Because we want B, D, and F. We don't have a D anywhere. We have a B and an F, though. And we have a B in the bass. So even though this A is a non-chord tone on a strong beat, it's not concerning me too much because of this B in the bass. Same thing with this G. This is on a weak beat, so I'm really not concerned about it. But again, this B in the bass is kind of winning out. And we have 2 chord tones, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. Cool? Let's do one more. Here's F. And this is a lot like this first bar we looked at where we're just walking right up the scale, except here we're walking right down the scale. So here we have an F, F sharp, remember, because our key signature, if I scroll over here, has an F sharp in it. It's bass clef. Here's our treble clef, F sharp. So here we have an F sharp. So an F sharp in the key of D is the 3rd scale degree, okay? So that means we're on a minor chord, and it's going to be F sharp, here's an F sharp, and an A and a C. Those are our chord tones that we're looking for here. So we have an F sharp and an A. Those are chord tones. G is a non-chord tone. And we have an F sharp as a chord tone, and then E is a non-chord tone. So again, just like this bar, we have chord tones on strong beats, 1 and 3. We have chord tone, we have the root in the bass. We have non-chord tones on weak beats. Pretty safe bet that we're on an F sharp. So those are just a couple clues, and sometimes you just have to use your ear on this. Like, does it sound like let's go back to this particular case. Here's a D, and we have a D and an F. We could make a case that the chord is E and G, so it's maybe an E chord, or if we went the other way, a C chord. So if this was the bottom third, we would add a note on top to make the other third, which would be a B. And if this was the top third, we would add a note on the bottom, which would be a C, to finish out the triad. So we could make a case that it was an E chord or a C chord, but use your ear. Does it feel like a C chord, or does it feel like a D chord? I think this bass note is really going to tell you that it feels like a D chord. So sometimes you just have to use your ear. Those are what non-chord tones are. Now in a future class, I'm going to get more nitty-gritty into those other terms for specifically what kinds of non-chord tones there are, because when you're doing an analysis in something like a college class, it isn't enough just to identify something as a non-chord tone. You have to specify what kind of non-chord tone it is. So we'll talk about that in the near future. But now you know what non-chord tones are and how to identify them. Great, let's do another analysis.